In this podcast, Sally Johnston, Manager of Food and Beverage at MPO, answers frequently asked questions by verifiers about the philosophy of the Food Act.
How do I know when a business has managed or properly taken care of a risk?
So a verifier will understand the hazards that are present in a food business, and the verifier should have done their homework before going into the food business to understand the products and processes that that business is likely to be using or making, and the hazards that go along with that. And so they will have a pretty good idea about the kinds of hazards that will exist and the kinds of consequences that could happen if those hazards are not controlled. And they will also have information about some of the controls that are appropriate in managing those hazards. So essentially, if you walk into a business as a verifier, having done your homework and understanding what the top 5 are for that food business, then essentially you're just going through and saying, in terms of these top 5, are the businesses doing a good enough job that that I can have confidence that they are managing those hazards, or that the hazards are controlled. So I think there's an awful lot of information in the guidance that we provide, whether it's the National Program Guidance or the Template Food Control Plan, but also our hazard database for verifiers to refer to understand what kinds of things we're looking for a business to be doing. And I guess if a business is doing something really different from that, so they might be on a custom food control plan, or they might have found an alternative way to manage their hazards, then it's about having that conversation with an open mind to work out whether or not that food business actually understands what they're doing and has made a conscious decision to manage risks in this way, or whether they've come up with a process and they really don't have any idea how that impacts on food safety. And there's really, there's some simple questions and interview techniques that you can use to work out whether or not somebody has come up with a process because it's convenient for the staff versus, yes, it's convenient for the staff, but we're confident it manages that hazard or that risk to food safety because. At the end of the day, again, it comes down to your own professional knowledge, your own gut feel, and having a chat with the food operator to understand where their level of knowledge is at. And if you're ever confused or you really strike something you don't know, there's a heap of people that you can ring and ask.
What's the philosophy around moving away from inspection and moving to coaching and education?
Okay, so essentially, I guess, through the other topics, we've discussed that floors, walls and ceilings on their own don't manage food safety. And we've also discussed that words on a page don't, on their own, manage food safety. That those things can help, but it's people that put them into practice. It's people that are managing food safety. And so the philosophy that moves us away from inspection into verification is exactly that. People, how does that saying go? People will do what is measured. So if the rules say you'll have white walls and you'll have coving and you'll have 3 wash hand basins, that's what people will focus on. The auditor's coming, I'd best have a wash hand basin put in because I got some extra staff and now I don't have enough. Oh gosh, I accidentally painted that wall purple last week, I best paint over it in white because that's what the verifier will be looking for, or the inspector will be looking for. And so if we write a set of prescriptive rules that you could inspect, chances are they're not going to address the most important part of food safety, and that is the behaviour of people. Because while we can write a prescriptive rule that says, all people will wash their hands every time they sneeze, the practicalities of you being able to inspect that, they're just not there. So what do? You go in and you sort of put some sneezing powder under their nose, make them sneeze, and then go and see if they wash their hands. It tells you nothing about whether or not they're going to wash their hands when they sneeze and you're not there. So the old rules, the floors, walls and ceilings, they were simple, consistent, relatively unchanging things that, you can walk in one day and if there's a wash hand basin there, chances are it'll be there the next time and the next time and the next time. But staff might not be. They might be here one day, not the next. The turnover in the food industry is really high. And if the most important thing to food safety is the people that are handling the food and making decisions about food, then a prescriptive rule about whether or not somebody wears an apron isn't actually going to improve food safety, because what's important is their knowledge and understanding and training and competency and behaviour and action. And on that, behaviour, if you want to change behaviour, almost the least effective version that you could use would be to tell somebody what to do. Essentially, people need to be able to make that choice themselves and come to that conclusion themselves. And you'll see that in different forms. Some people are really open about the easiest way to get me to do something is to tell me I can't. Or or if you tell me to do it, then I'll just do the exact opposite because that's just how I am. Some people are really open about it. A lot of people aren't really open about it, but they do that exact same thing. So having prescriptive rules around behaviour don't work so well, and that's why we haven't put in a whole bunch of prescriptive rules around the outcomes that we need in the Food Act. It really is providing a lot of flexibility so that people can find their way of doing it and come to their conclusion that they need to do this for their customers.
How can making observations add value to the business and encourage owners to take responsibility for their food safety?
I think a verifier using observation of behaviours is, again, acting as an educator or coach. If you're walking around with the food business owner, very often the food business owner, they're not going to know as much as you about food safety. They're getting a lot of their information and their cues from you. So to a certain extent, this is a do as I do moment. So you're showing people, teaching people what to look out for and what behaviours to reward or what behaviours to jump in on quite quickly. And also observing where the manager already has some of that knowledge and is acting appropriately and reinforcing their own behaviours, the behaviours of that manager, that giving them confidence that they are focusing on the right things. Observation will tell you more about how food is being handled in that business than any records. People can sit down and write temperatures or sign bits of paper till the cows come home, but that doesn't tell you really anything about how they're doing their job. They might be probing the chicken every time it comes out of the oven, but if the probe sits open on a dirty bench and they never wash it and they probe the chicken and they take the temperature and then they pull the probe out and stick it back on the dirty bench, doesn't matter how many times they take the temperature, they've just contaminated the chicken. So the observation tells you far more about the food safety practices in that business than looking at a bunch of records that tell you whether or not they've taken temperatures. records can be valuable, but observation is far more valuable. It's also that opportunity to catch people doing things right and reinforcing that behaviour, or to see things where they can improve and to point it out at the time so they can understand in the context of what they are doing what the future behaviour needs to look like. And so the risk-based measures, I guess there's kind of two types. There's the food control plan, which is a plan. It's a set of procedures and processes, and it's, we've written a template, but essentially it's even better if the businesses write, what they do on a daily basis. But a template's cool. It's a cool starting point, and actually, yes, it's the law, but again, I would hate to think that verifiers are holding people to the letter of the law if they're doing something, a minor variation, but that still manages risk. This is where professional judgment and discretion come into play, because it's like nothing of what we've put out in law is intended to be, the gospel way. There's always little bits of grey, there's always little variations, and there's always that they're complying with the intent and objective of the law, even if they're not complying with the letter of the law. And we're not going to throw the book at people or make them feel bad if they're not following the letter of the law every single time. And no agency really, no enforcement agency ever does. We've got road rules, and it's do not travel above 50 kilometres an hour in a built-up zone, speed limit thing. And it's for a long time, you got a bit of a 10k leeway. At the moment, it's a 4k leeway. Maybe we'll get to there is no leeway, but that's not the norm. There's let's take into account the level of risk that this slightly non-compliant behaviour is presenting, and whether or not we can encourage people to slow down rather than just tell them, issue a fine every time they're going 51 kilometres or, so there's lots of elements in terms of the risk-based measures. The national program, there's 3 levels of national program. In theory, there should be a significant drop down in terms of the rules between each national program. When it came to developing the regulations and then basing the guidance on those regulations, it's become somewhat apparent that the amount of graduation that we had hoped for hasn't emerged yet. So I think that's something that we actually need to address. So the guidance is just that. It is guidance. It is consistent with the regulations, but again, we're relying on verifiers using their professional judgment and having good confidence in their professional judgment not to go overboard. If this is a low-risk food business and if they're managing their risks appropriately, then let's not get all carried away, because that doesn't do anybody any good, and it's not consistent with the intent of what we're trying to achieve in the Act, which is to essentially reward those that are doing, or acknowledge those, recognise those that are doing a good job of managing their risks, even if they're not within the letter of the law, and to encourage those that aren't managing their risks to do better.
What do you expect to be the difference between verifying a high-risk business and a low-risk business?
So I guess a lower risk food business, if you were comparing, say, a very high risk business with 50 employees and then a lower risk business with 50 employees, if all things were identical about the businesses except the types of products that they were making, then 2 things would probably become apparent. You wouldn't be looking for the same things in each business, so you would be verifying different things, and again, the top 5 are different for different sectors. But the other thing is that a lower risk business probably will not take as long to verify. because the level of control needed is actually less. You know, there is more tolerance. They can get more stuff wrong and still not affect the risk of that food. Whereas a high-risk food business, you know, they really do have to be on the ball, because it doesn't take much for that food to become a problem to people eating it. So we would expect that if all other things were equal, then verification would take less time in a lower risk food business, assuming that they're doing generally okay. You know, a low risk food business that's getting everything wrong is still going to take a wee while to work through. And it's not necessarily that you'll be taking a wee while to go and check more things, it's that the time is going to be spent in working with that business to understand what they need to do better and to get that confidence that they're going to manage those risks better on an ongoing basis. So it's not about verification taking longer because you're finding things wrong. Isn't necessarily about going and verifying more topics. It's about spending the time to get the business to understand what they need to do to fix stuff, you know, to take responsibility, to understand where they're going wrong, and to start to make that choice to do things right, you know. So yeah, but a business is doing well. Yeah, I think. I think under the risk-based measure system, you know, there are always some exceptions to the rules, and we know that some verifiers think that some sectors shouldn't be under the risk-based measure that they are, and are higher risk than what that risk-based measure would suggest. In some cases you did right, but that is a political decision that has been made, and we are tasked with implementing that decision. And so even though it might make you uncomfortable, the reality is that that we need to make that work. And MPI will be looking at other ways that we can be sure that the risk-based measure is appropriate and giving a good outcome for that sector. Verifiers shouldn't be spending longer in those businesses just because they think it should be under a different risk-based measure, if they're genuinely supposed to be on that risk-based measure. I mean, like sometimes you walk into a business and they've registered on National Program 2 and they really should be food control plan. That's a problem. You need to deal with that problem. But if they are a National Program 2 business on a National Program 2, then you need to be mindful of the intent of the Act and the reasons why the politicians made the decisions that they did. I mean, like in a verification, essentially the way that I would kind of probably do it is I would probably walk into the business and have a bit of a chat about what I'm there to do, blah, blah, blah. And then I'd probably kind of go, okay, well, you know, what's your best selling item, or what, you know, or look at the menu and kind of go, okay, or what are they doing today? Oh, so they're making chicken sandwiches. Oh, well, let's just go and have a look at them doing that. And then, you know, asking a few questions and watching the behaviours, and, you know, it might be, where do you get your chicken from, which is an opening to say, oh, you know, I get it from the supermarket, or I've got an approved supplier. Okay, so what have you talked to with your supplier about in terms of what their responsibilities are? Do you know that they're registered? You know, what have you done? Those sorts of things. So I'd be tending to follow along, almost a little bit of a snapshot a day in their life, just following along how they do some stuff and making observations along the way that I would then come back towards the end, you know, hey, can I have 10 minutes just to gather my thoughts? And then I'd be going, okay, well, that's approved supplier program, that's cleaning, that's training and competency, that's you know, personal hygiene, washing their hands or wearing protective clothing. This is temperature control. Oh, look, I've seen my top 5, done, dusted, tick. You know, and was everything good or was it not? But as we're going through, it's kind of like, oh, you know, I noticed that they pulled that chicken out of the fridge and put it on the bench, and now they've gone and cut up an apple for that 2-year-old kid without washing their hands in between you know, did you see that? You know, or I'd be watching the manager and seeing whether the manager leaps in and, you know, reinforces with the staff member, hang on a minute, you've made a mistake. And I'd be like, so why didn't you? Did you see the mistake? Why didn't you intervene? You know, so those sorts of things, you know.